In the heart of a war-torn European town, the air was thick with uncertainty and fear. The once bustling streets, which had been filled with the laughter of children and the chatter of market vendors, were now eerily silent, save for the occasional echo of hurried footsteps or the distant rumble of military vehicles. The sound of bombings was a constant reminder of the world that had fallen into chaos. 4 months, the town had lived under the oppressive shadow of Nazi occupation, a cruel and suffocating presence that had stripped the citizens of their dignity and hope. The occupying forces, with their relentless control, had turned the town into a place of misery, where freedom was a distant memory and survival was the only daily concern. As the war intensified, the civilians in this town had grown accustomed to the oppressive weight of fear, but something had shifted in recent weeks. Rumors spread like wildfire through the town's narrow alleys, carried by whispering voices in the shadows. There were reports of Allied forces moving closer, British, American, and other Allied troops making advances, pushing the Nazis back. The civilians could feel the shift in the air. It was both a terrifying and thrilling prospect. The thought of liberation was tantalizing, but the fear of what could happen before it arrived kept them on edge. Many knew that the occupying forces would not let go of their hold without a brutal fight. As the reality of their situation set in, the townspeople found themselves caught in a cruel paradox. They were trapped between the hope of salvation and the terror of rejection. The news that the Allies might be coming was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the prospect of freedom offered a flicker of hope, but on the other, the fear of being turned away loomed large. The civilians had no illusions about their place in the world. They were refugees, displaced by war, without a country of their own. They had nowhere to go, no allies to rely on, and no guarantee of safety, even if the British forces did manage to break through. The town was filled with families who had lost everything. Homes destroyed, loved ones killed, lives upended. Many had already fled from nearby villages and cities that had been ravaged by the war. Now, with the advancing Allied forces within reach, there was no certainty that they would be welcomed. The thought of being turned away at the border by the British, or worse, caught by the Nazis, was a fear that gnawed at them every waking hour. Yet, it was the only option they had left. There was no future to speak of in their current situation, just the ever-present danger of being caught in the crossfire. In their small homes, families huddled together, silently contemplating their futures. Mothers held their children close, their eyes haunted by the ghosts of what they had seen. Fathers, who had once been the pillars of their communities, now stood in the corner of rooms, unsure of how to protect their families from an enemy that seemed to be everywhere. The air was thick with a kind of helplessness, a collective understanding that survival was no longer a matter of individual effort, it was a matter of pure luck. The fear of rejection was not just about being turned away from a foreign land, it was also about the deep, existential terror of being forgotten, of being lost in the chaos of war. Would the British even care about the plight of these civilians? Would they look at them as nothing more than burdens, undeserving of refuge? Or would they see the humanity in their eyes, the same humanity that the Nazis had tried to erase? In this moment, the civilians felt like pawns in a game they had no control over, their fate resting in the hands of foreign powers who might never even know their names. Among them, there were whispers of hope, though faint and fragile. There were those who held onto the belief that the British would open their doors, that compassion would triumph over fear. They clung to the idea that, even in the darkest hours of war, there were still those who cared, who understood the value of human life beyond borders and politics. These whispers spread like wildfire, giving the people something to hold on to, even as the future seemed impossibly bleak. But for many, hope was a distant dream, overshadowed by the harsh realities they faced daily. The town's landscape mirrored their internal struggles. The once vibrant homes now lay in ruins, with shattered windows and collapsed roofs. Buildings that had once been filled with life now stood empty, abandoned by those who had either fled or been taken away. The streets, once alive with the noise of commerce, were now deserted except for the occasional soldier marching through, their boots echoing on the broken pavement. The town was a shell of what it had once been, just as its people were shells of their former selves, broken, weary, and unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Still, Despite the fear and uncertainty, the civilians did what they could to prepare. They gathered what little they had left: clothes, food, whatever could fit into a small bag. Families huddled together in the evenings, sharing what little warmth they could muster as they discussed the possibility of leaving. There was a strange kind of urgency in the air, as if time was running out and they had to act quickly before the opportunity vanished. The thought of crossing into British territory, of finding refuge on the other side of the war, was the only hope they had left. But the question remained: would they be accepted? As the days passed, the tension grew unbearable. The civilians watched the horizon, waiting for signs of the advancing British troops. Every plane that flew overhead, every distant rumble of artillery, brought with it the faint hope that salvation was near. Yet, with that hope came an overwhelming sense of fear. What if the British arrived only to find the town already abandoned, its people gone or worse, left to die at the hands of the Nazis? What if the British, in their own struggles, did not have the resources or the will to take them in? And so, the civilians waited. They clung to the fragile thread of hope, their hearts divided between the terror of rejection and the desperate desire for freedom. The days blurred together, each one feeling like a lifetime, each one bringing them closer to an uncertain future. The weight of their fears, their hopes, and their dreams pressed heavily on them, but there was no turning back. The decision had already been made. The only question now was whether or not the British would keep their word. Would they open their doors to the frightened civilians who had already lost so much? Or would they, too, turn their backs on the suffering of others, leaving them to face whatever horrors the war still had in store? In the depths of their fear, the civilians held on to that small, flickering hope, the hope that when the British finally arrived, they would find not just a city of refugees, but a city of people who, despite everything, still believed in the possibility of kindness, in the belief that doors could still be opened, even in the darkest hours of war. It was that belief, fragile and uncertain, that carried them through the long nights and sleepless days, as they waited for the moment when their fate would be sealed. Behind the walls of government offices in London, the decision about what to do with the thousands of refugees fleeing Nazi occupation weighed heavily on the minds of British officials. The air was thick with tension and uncertainty, as high-ranking officers and politicians gathered in rooms dimly lit by the smoky haze of war. The fate of these civilians, many of whom had nothing left but their lives and the clothes on their backs, was now in the hands of a select few who could determine whether they would live or die. The stakes were high, not just for those seeking refuge but for Britain itself, grappling with the dire consequences of the conflict and the growing need to maintain its own strength and resources. The corridors of Whitehall were abuzz with discussions of strategy, military logistics, and the inevitable long-term consequences of opening British doors to such a large influx of refugees. For some in power, the idea of letting in displaced civilians seemed like an insurmountable burden. The British Empire was already embroiled in a brutal global war, and many feared that accepting refugees would stretch the country's already limited resources even thinner. There was an underlying concern about the public perception of such an act. How would it affect the morale of those still fighting, or those already on the home front? The nation had already seen bombings, food rationing, and immense suffering. How could they afford to take in more people? There was also the ever-present worry of security. Would the influx of refugees inadvertently provide cover for spies, enemy agents, or sympathizers? What if accepting them created a vulnerability at a time when Britain was fighting for its very survival? These arguments were met with a growing sense of moral unease. While many argued for caution, others began to question whether the decision could truly be reduced to mere logistics. It was in these quiet moments of reflection that a handful of compassionate officials began to ask themselves a far deeper, more human question: what was the cost of turning away those in desperate need? Could they really live with the consequences of leaving entire families to fend for themselves in the face of Nazi brutality? Would their country, whose history was steeped in the defense of freedom and justice, become complicit in a betrayal of its own ideals? A wave of growing empathy swept through certain factions of the British leadership. These voices called for Britain to be a beacon of refuge in a time of unprecedented global suffering. Behind closed doors, ministers began to push for a more generous response to the crisis, arguing that the principles upon which Britain had built its reputation, humanity, decency, and the rule of law, demanded that the nation take action. But even as these ideas took root, they found themselves opposed by those whose worldview was shaped more by pragmatism and caution. There were concerns, of course, about the sheer number of refugees and how to manage the logistics of their integration. Some suggested creating camps or other temporary solutions, but no one could predict the scale of what was unfolding. It was a slow, internal battle as decision-makers wrestled with their own consciences. Some felt the moral imperative to act, while others feared the repercussions. The debates were not just political but profoundly personal. What would history say of Britain's response? Could they live with the stain of turning their backs on people who were, in essence, no different than the millions of British citizens suffering under the same weight of war? Would the world and future generations judge them harshly if they failed to extend a hand in this critical moment? Meanwhile, the refugees continued to flee, driven by a hope that was as fragile as the boats they climbed into. The town they had just left was bracing for what seemed like the final collapse, and they knew that their only chance of survival now rested on the mercy of a foreign power. Yet, they had no way of knowing whether Britain would choose compassion or self-preservation. The reality of war meant that mercy and justice often collided with the harsh realities of limited resources. What could be done for these civilians, so far from their homes, so close to the edge of despair? It was at this crossroads of moral quandary and pragmatic reality that a letter arrived on the desk of one British official. Its contents were not from a fellow politician or military leader, but from an anonymous group of humanitarian workers. The letter appealed to the government's better nature, urging them to take action. It spoke not of strategy or logistics, but of the faces of the displaced, of the children who had lost their families, of the elderly left to die alone. It was a raw, emotional plea that bypassed the political intricacies of the debate and went straight to the heart. The letter painted vivid images of the destruction the refugees had endured, and it left the official who read it feeling as though something had shifted deep inside. The letter's power was undeniable, and it sparked a quiet revolution in the thinking of those who had been reluctant to act. No longer could the issue be framed solely in terms of resources and security. The question now was one of moral clarity. Could Britain, with its reputation as a land of freedom and justice, stand by and do nothing while people were slaughtered, displaced, and left to perish in the streets of Europe? The letter, though anonymous, carried with it a sense of urgency that pushed those in power to re-evaluate their stance. And as the war raged on, it was clear that the time for indecision had passed. The world was watching, and history would not look kindly on inaction. Yet, the decision was not made easily. For every voice that called for compassion, there were others who warned of the dangers of extending too much mercy, too quickly. The British government had to think of the long-term ramifications of any action it took, both for its own citizens and for the wider war effort. There were military resources to be considered, and the war was still far from over. Britain had to be careful not to weaken itself at a time when the struggle against Nazi Germany had reached a critical point. But as the weeks passed, the debate began to turn. Those who had once argued against accepting refugees now found themselves reconsidering, influenced by the weight of the human stories that had started to seep into their consciousness. They began to see the refugees not as a political issue, but as people in desperate need of help. And slowly, as the public sentiment began to shift, the government too began to understand that offering refuge to those fleeing the Nazis could be both a humanitarian duty and a powerful symbol of Britain's resolve to fight for the values it held dear. At last, the decision was made. The British government, after much deliberation and debate, would open its doors to the refugees. The doors that had once been imagined as closed and impenetrable would slowly begin to creak open, offering a fragile but precious chance for survival. It was a decision that would not only change the lives of the civilians who had fled, but also alter the course of history, marking a moral victory for Britain at a time when the world seemed overwhelmed by darkness. Though the decision was a triumph of humanity, it was not without its complications. There were still logistical challenges to address, and the work of welcoming thousands of displaced civilians into the country would not be easy. But for the moment, the most important step had been taken. Britain had chosen to stand on the side of mercy, and in doing so, had opened a door that many thought would never open, a door that would lead not just to safety for the refugees, but to a renewed sense of purpose for Britain itself, as a nation that would not shy away from doing what was right, even when faced with immense difficulty. As news of the British decision to offer refuge to the thousands of refugees spread, it was met with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. The civilians who had been desperately bracing for rejection, preparing for the unthinkable, fearing that they would be turned away, left to face an even darker fate, now found themselves caught between a fragile dream and the daunting reality of escape. Their town, still under the grip of Nazi occupation, had become a place of both sorrow and possibility. The air was thick with tension, and while hope began to flicker in the hearts of many, the fear of the unknown kept them anchored to their grim surroundings. It was one thing to dream of freedom, to wish for deliverance from the tyranny that had claimed their lives, but it was another thing entirely to take the leap of faith required to seek refuge in a foreign land. As families began to prepare for the journey ahead, the streets of the town grew frantic with activity. Children, clutching the few belongings they could carry, wandered aimlessly as their parents hurried to pack whatever scraps of life remained in their homes. For many, there was no time to gather more than the barest essentials: a few clothes, some food, perhaps a treasured heirloom or photograph. Everything else had already been left behind in the wake of the war. The streets, once bustling with the energy of daily life, were now littered with the remnants of lives uprooted by the violence of conflict. Buildings that had once been symbols of stability and normalcy were now broken shells, their facades shattered by the constant bombardment. The civilians were faced with the heartbreaking reality that their lives as they had known them were over, and there was no going back. Despite the chaos, there was a new sense of urgency in the air. Word had come from the town's leaders, who had received confirmation from British officials that transport ships were being prepared to bring the refugees across the sea to safety. The message was clear: the chance of escape was real, but it would not last forever. The British would only be able to take so many people, and there were limits to how much help they could provide. Time was running out, and the civilians knew they had to act quickly. For some, it was a matter of life and death. For others, it was the last chance to save what little remained of their family. The decision to leave was not an easy one. Many families had already experienced the trauma of displacement, having fled their homes once, only to be forced to run again. Now, the prospect of yet another journey, one into the unknown, filled them with dread. There was no certainty that they would be accepted once they reached the British shore. There was no guarantee of safety on the other side of the channel. But they had no choice. They could not stay where they were, and so they prepared to leave. As the days passed, the town began to empty. Families gathered in secret, exchanging final farewells, and those who could offered whatever help they could to their neighbors. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, where class, status, and background were forgotten in the face of a collective need for survival. The refugees, though they had once been divided by the barriers of social status or political affiliation, now found themselves united by a common fate. The war had stripped them of their former identities, and all that remained was the universal need for safety. There were no borders between them now, only a desperate, collective hope that they might find a place to call home again. For some, the decision to leave was straightforward. The horrors they had witnessed, the atrocities that had been committed in their presence, left them with no illusions about the dangers that awaited them if they remained. For others, the decision was more complicated. The uncertainty of what lay ahead, the fear of the unknown, made the choice agonizing. Some still clung to the hope that things might improve, that the British might not be able to take in all the refugees, or that perhaps they might find safety elsewhere. But as the days wore on, that hope began to fade. The reality of the war was undeniable, and the danger of remaining was far too great. The refugees had no choice but to take the leap and trust that the promise of safety was real. The journey to the British ships was fraught with danger. The Nazi forces, ever vigilant, patrolled the roads and waterways, searching for signs of resistance or defection. The refugees had to move quickly, often under the cover of darkness, to avoid detection. For many, the journey was not just a physical one, but an emotional and psychological battle as well. The uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on their hearts, and the fear that they might be turned back or caught at any moment was a constant companion. As they moved toward the coast, they crossed fields, passed through forests, and navigated the maze of ruined villages and towns that had once been their homes. The land itself seemed to reflect the devastation that had been wrought upon their lives. Everywhere they looked, they saw the marks of war, the scorched earth, the crumbling buildings, the twisted remains of vehicles abandoned in haste. It was as though the world itself had been torn apart, and there was no safe place left to hide. At the coast, the refugees gathered in makeshift camps, where they waited for the ships that would carry them away. The uncertainty of their situation never fully dissipated. The British ships had been promised, but no one knew when or if they would arrive. Days stretched into weeks, and the waiting took its toll. The refugees, exhausted from their long journey, faced the grueling reality of their situation. There was little to eat, little to do but wait. The threat of being discovered and captured by Nazi patrols hung over them like a dark cloud, but the thought of being turned away from Britain's shores was equally terrifying. Would they be met with open arms, or would they find that the doors they had so longed for would remain shut? The ships finally arrived in the dead of night, their silhouettes barely visible against the darkened horizon. The sight of the British vessels, large and imposing, brought a wave of relief to the refugees, but it also intensified the fear of rejection. There was no turning back now. They had come so far, risked so much, and yet they could not know for certain whether the British would keep their promise. The boats were crowded with people, families, children, elderly men and women, each one carrying the same hope, the same fear. The refugees clung to the belief that the British, who had offered them the chance to escape, would not turn them away at the last moment. As they boarded the ships, the tension was palpable. The sound of footsteps echoed across the wooden planks, and the murmur of anxious voices filled the air. Some refugees clutched their children to their chests, while others looked out to the sea, eyes filled with a mixture of longing and fear. What awaited them on the other side? Would they find the safety they had dreamed of, or would they face more rejection, more danger, more uncertainty? The journey across the channel was treacherous, and the waters seemed to reflect the turmoil inside the hearts of those on board. The boats rocked in the dark waves, and the sound of the wind howling through the sails only heightened the sense of vulnerability that hung over them. The crossing was long and fraught with danger, but as the ships approached the British shore, a sense of cautious optimism began to take root. The sight of the coast brought a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the lingering fear that the promise of refuge might still be denied. They had made it this far, but the final test remained. As the ships docked, the refugees anxiously waited to see what would happen next. Would the British keep their word? Would the doors open, or would they be turned away, abandoned to face the horrors of war once again? And then the unthinkable happened. As the ships docked on British soil, the doors that had been feared to remain closed slowly began to open. Refugees were not met with hostility or suspicion, but with the warmth of human compassion. The British soldiers who stood at the port, once cold and distant, now offered a hand, helping families disembark. The civilians, their hearts heavy with the burden of what they had endured, were greeted not with scorn but with a genuine offer of refuge. The sense of relief was overwhelming, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the refugees began to believe that their journey had not been in vain. They had arrived at the place they had longed for, and now, for the first time, they could truly begin to imagine a future free from the shadow of war. The moment of arrival was like a surreal dream, the heavy weight of uncertainty still lingering in the air even as the boats came closer to British shores. After the long, treacherous crossing of the English Channel, the refugees disembarked onto the cold, gray docks with a mixture of emotions. It was a moment they had feared might never come, a moment that had seemed almost too distant, too uncertain to trust. But as the ships gently rocked against the pier, the first steps onto British soil became an almost sacred act of survival, a fragile bridge between what had been and what might be. For so long, they had lived in the shadow of fear of rejection, of being turned away, of facing a future unknown. Yet here they were, standing on foreign soil, looking at a horizon that held the possibility of hope. The last few days had been a blur of exhaustion and anxiety, and now, in this pivotal moment, the refugees dared to breathe, to believe in the chance that lay before them. As the first refugees set foot on the dock, the scene was not one of celebration but of cautious anticipation. The British soldiers who greeted them, dressed in their military uniforms, stood at attention, their faces somber yet human. The refugees, weary and frightened, looked at them with wide eyes, not sure whether the promises made would truly hold. The fear of rejection was still alive in their hearts. Would the British authorities truly honor their word? Would they be accepted into this land, or would they find themselves abandoned at the mercy of the very forces they had fled? The uncertainty that had defined their journey now accompanied them into this new phase. Even though the doors had been opened, the true test had yet to come. As the refugees were ushered from the ships and onto the dock, the reality of their displacement hit them all over again. The physical and emotional toll of the journey had left its mark on them. Some were frail, unable to walk without assistance. Others carried children who had not spoken in days, too traumatized by the violence of the war. There were the elderly, who had endured the worst of the bombing campaigns, and there were the young mothers, their faces drawn and pale, clutching their babies as if they were the last tether to a life they could never return to. The horror of what they had witnessed was evident in every face. The war had ravaged not just their homes and their bodies but their very souls. And yet, there was a quiet defiance in their eyes, a glimmer of resilience that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of the unimaginable. The refugees were guided through a series of temporary holding areas set up by the British authorities. The coldness of the concrete walls and the functional, no-frills nature of the camps stood in stark contrast to the warmth of human connection that began to blossom within them. Despite the hardship, despite the conditions that were far from ideal, there was an undeniable sense of relief in the air. They had made it. They had crossed the threshold, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, they were not alone. The compassion of the British people was already beginning to show. Volunteers, some British citizens and some other refugees who had already been granted asylum, were distributing food, blankets, and medical supplies. They moved through the crowds with a sense of purpose, determined to alleviate some of the suffering that had followed the refugees across the channel. Still, the process of adaptation was far from easy. The refugees, still unsure of their place in this new world, looked to the British authorities for guidance, but they could not help but feel the weight of their own displacement. They had left behind everything they knew, their homes, their families, their traditions, and now they were faced with the challenge of starting anew in a foreign land, a land that they had only heard of in stories and rumors. The language barrier was a constant reminder of how far they had come and how much they still had to learn. Many of them spoke no English, and they had little understanding of British customs or culture. The idea of integrating into British society seemed like an insurmountable task, a process that would take far more than just the temporary safety that the British had so generously offered. But amid the uncertainty, there was a sense of hope that began to rise, like a flickering flame in the midst of darkness. The British authorities, recognizing the delicate nature of the situation, began to work quickly to provide the refugees with the support they needed. They established temporary shelters, set up distribution points for food and clothing, and began to process the refugees so that they could be placed in more permanent housing. Social workers and other professionals were brought in to help with the psychological trauma that many of the refugees had endured. These were people who had lost everything, who had seen their homes destroyed and their loved ones murdered. The toll of war had broken them, but the British response, however imperfect, was a step toward healing. It was in these early days that the refugees began to see that the British doors they had feared would remain closed were, in fact, wide open to them. The offers of food, clothing, and shelter were not just acts of charity, they were acts of humanity. And while the fear of rejection still lingered in the minds of some, it was replaced by a growing sense of belonging. They had been received not as burdens, not as problems to be solved, but as human beings who had suffered in ways that most could never imagine. The compassion they encountered was not a token gesture, but a genuine desire to help. It was a stark contrast to the dehumanizing experience they had suffered under Nazi rule, where they had been seen as little more than numbers, statistics, or obstacles to be eliminated. In the weeks that followed, the process of integration began, though it was slow and fraught with challenges. Many refugees were placed in temporary housing, small apartments or cottages in the countryside, where they could begin to rebuild their lives. The homes were far from luxurious, but they provided the basic security that had been missing for so long. For many of the refugees, the feeling of having a roof over their heads, of not having to sleep in the cold or fear the sound of bombers overhead, was almost more than they could bear. It was a small comfort, but it was a comfort nonetheless. The challenge of rebuilding their lives, however, was not so easily overcome. In many ways, the refugees were starting from scratch. They had lost their homes, their jobs, their possessions, and in some cases, their families. Some had to learn new skills to survive in a country whose language they barely understood. Others struggled with the psychological scars of war, memories of loved ones lost, of violence witnessed, of lives shattered beyond repair. There were moments of deep despair, moments when the refugees questioned whether they could truly find peace in this new land. But there were also moments of quiet joy. As the weeks turned into months, and the initial shock of displacement began to wear off, the refugees started to find a rhythm in their new lives. They began to connect with the communities they had been placed in, and many found work, slowly but steadily. The British people, too, began to adjust to the presence of the refugees in their midst. There were, of course, those who viewed the influx of displaced people with suspicion, who feared that their country would be overrun by those from foreign lands. But there were also many who welcomed the refugees with open arms, eager to help in whatever way they could. Churches, charities, and local organizations rallied to provide support, ensuring that the refugees had access to the services they needed. It was a difficult and sometimes painful process, but it was one that was marked by kindness and compassion at every turn. In time, the refugees began to find their place in British society. Many who had once been farmers, shopkeepers, or artisans in their own lands found similar work in their new communities. The resilience they had developed in the face of war and displacement served them well as they adapted to their new lives. And though they would never forget the horrors they had endured, the kindness they found in Britain began to heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon them. It was not a perfect process, and many challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, the refugees could look to the future with hope in their hearts. The doors that had once seemed so impossibly far away were now wide open, and though the journey had been long and fraught with fear, it had ultimately led them to a place of safety, a place where they could begin the slow, difficult work of rebuilding not just their lives, but their sense of self. The promise of refuge, though fragile at first, had been kept, and with it came the possibility of a new beginning. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the refugees could breathe deeply, knowing that their survival was no longer a matter of luck, but of human decency. The refugees who had arrived on British shores with such trepidation were now at the threshold of a new life, one that promised the safety and stability they had longed for but had not dared to hope for. For the first time in years, they could imagine a future beyond the endless struggle for survival. But this new beginning, though full of promise, was not without its challenges. The warmth of their welcome in Britain had begun to ease the deep, lingering fears they had carried with them across the sea, yet they faced a new and often daunting reality. They had survived the horrors of war, the dislocation of their lives, and the endless uncertainty of their journey, but now they were tasked with rebuilding, with forging new identities and new communities in a land that was foreign to them in every sense. In the early weeks of their arrival, the refugees found themselves in a world both familiar and alien. The bustling streets of British towns, the sounds of a language they barely understood, the strange customs and manners of people who had lived untouched by the devastation of war, these things created a sense of both opportunity and isolation. The refugees were offered shelter in small towns, rural villages, and even larger cities, where they were assigned to homes or temporary accommodations that were often far from their original hopes or expectations. The basic promise of security, however, was something that could never be taken for granted. They had left their homes under duress, under the constant threat of violence, and though the British offered them refuge, the journey toward integration was long and uncertain. For many, the first real shock came in the form of language. The refugees, for the most part, did not speak English. They had fled from countries where their own languages were spoken, where their customs were shared, and where they had found comfort in knowing that they could communicate with those around them. In Britain, this was no longer the case. Simple tasks, such as buying food, asking for directions, or seeking help for a sick child, became monumental struggles.